Thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Chris Coverage. I'm the editor with MySecurityTV, and this is episode 1, the opening episode of our Security and Risk Professional Insight series. We're looking at advancements and applications for critical infrastructure protection and high security environments. This is the 4th year that we've run this particular series. Previously has been the Security Consultant Insight series, but we just wanted to broaden it out. And we look at a whole range of different aspects of the security domain here in Australia and the region. The protocols, this is being recorded. We do welcome questions from the audience, and I'll moderate this while I'm speaking and while people are coming in. But if you do have some questions or comments, keep them obviously polite and to the point and constructive, but they are welcome, and please use the Q&A. And we'll have a hard stop on this at 2 o'clock. We'll go for about 60 minutes. There's a lot to discuss, and as Malcolm's been highlighting there is increasing conflict there between Israel and Iran direct, which is the first time. So it is quite significant, and also on the back of significant events here in Sydney, both attacks on public places and places of worship. So this has all been set up way before any of this has happened, but it's all been bubbling away. Thank you to our sponsors, Curtin University, our national sponsor in terms of our channels of what we cover with space, cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection, and our series sponsors, a security exhibition and conference, which has been held at the ICC in Sydney in August, and DAVCOR Group, which distributes the EKA Cyberlock and EVER access to security. And the series has also been supported by the Australian Security Industry Association Limited, ASIAL, ACES International Australian chapters, and the Association, the Australian Institute of Professional Intelligence Officers as well, AIPIO. I've split this up into 2. I've gathered the best heads that I can find. Malcolm and I have dealt a number of times over the years. Jill Savage we've had on as well. Professor Sissel Hagdal-Jor, she's a visiting professor with Edith Cowan University in Perth. She'll be joining us for the next episode, but she's a professor in Norway and has been looking at these same issues for Norway as well. Gary Hale, Director of National Resilience and Security Program Office in the CSO with Curtin University. And I'll flip over to Dr. Shannon Ford. He's a Senior Lecturer in Faculty of Humanities, also at Curtin University, will be joining us next session. Brian DeCaries, Chief Executive Officer with the Australian Security Industry Association Limited, and I think it's really important to bring in the industry as to what we're going to be seeing here nationally as well. And Stephen Beaumont, AM, Non-Executive Director and Chair with the Critical Infrastructure ISAC as well, and hopefully he's in the background as I bring the panel together. So this session, as I mentioned, split into 2. Malcolm Davis, Jill Savage and Stephen Beaumont. We're going to be looking at the requirements and implications on the private security sector in a phase of multi-regional conflict. Malcolm, maybe just an update for this particular session, because this is recorded and will be kicking off the series. As to the and Australia's just released the defence strategy and the like, and I know that you've got sort of different perspectives than what maybe the Australian government has on the Indo-Pacific region. But yeah, just maybe a current state of play as you see it, and then maybe some of the direct implications that are likely to be here in Australia.
Okay, well, as we sit here talking about this, all hell is breaking loose in the Middle East with Israel attacking Iran and Iran likely to retaliate. And I think that should demonstrate to Australian decision makers how things can change very rapidly and very unexpectedly. And when you look at Australian defence policy now, including the 2023 Defence Strategic Review and the 2024 National Defence Strategy, they both build on the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, which recognised that we no longer have 10 years of strategic warning time to rely on. We are in a situation now where a crisis could occur in our region in areas such as the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea at any time. And so I think that we are facing the real prospect in our region of increasing tension between China and the United States over issues such as Taiwan and the South China Sea, as well as obviously tensions continuing on the Korean Peninsula as a result of North Korea's continued build-up of its nuclear weapons. such that we do have to take the risk of major power conflict very seriously, and we have to recognize that this could happen as early as the second half of this decade. So I think one of the criticisms that seems to be coming out with the National Defence Strategy that was released yesterday is that it does seem to embrace a strategy of hope that nothing bad will happen in this decade, so that gives us time to get these transformational capabilities in place by the 2030s. Obviously, we all hope that nothing bad does happen, but we can't assume that nothing bad will happen. We have to assume instead that China, for example, is determined to impose unification on Taiwan against the wishes of the Taiwanese people, if through the use of force if necessary. And we have to assume that the United States might step in to support Taiwan, and would expect Australia to support the United States under the various different alliance agreements. So in terms of our defence planning, I think we have to cover both short-term contingencies that could occur in the second half of this decade, and prepare for a longer-term uncertain future, which I think the NDS, the National Defence Strategy, and the IIP do quite well. What it doesn't do well is prepare for that short-term contingency, and I think that has to be the big concern. I think also we can't just focus on the Indo-Pacific region. We have to recognise that events in Europe, such as that are emerging as a result of the war in Ukraine, have direct bearing on decisions being made in the Indo-Pacific. Events in the Middle East clearly have an effect on us. As we're sitting here, oil has gone up by 4% in price right now, and so that's going to drive up inflation. That's going to affect our economy, and that's a serious concern. So everything is interlinked in a globalized world order, and part of the challenge we do face is an axis of authoritarian states, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, working to challenge and overturn the established rules-based order. That's part of a global threat that is beginning to emerge. And when you see key decision makers in Europe openly talking about the possibility of war between NATO and Russia in the next few years, and openly stating that Europe is in a pre-war period, we need to take that seriously. So I think that my summary of the defence environment and the strategic environment, the way I see it, is that we are in a pre-war period now, and we need to start planning our defences around the possibility of major power conflict occurring in our region, and indeed at a global level within the next decade. And that will require greater investment into defence than what is currently planned for under the National Defence Strategy and the Integrated Investment Program. It will require greater readiness and ability to sustain protracted operations, and an ability to mobilise very quickly. So thankfully, the National Defence Strategy and the Integrated Investment Program are a biennial process. So we will have another one in 2026, and that gives us a chance to look at how the current one proceeds and correct any oversights or gaps in the current National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment Program, and hopefully respond. But I would close by saying time is not our friend. We don't have a lot of time to essentially rely on no bad things happening in this decade. We have to prepare for the worst, and I think government needs to grasp that reality and respond to it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. And I suppose when you look at that sort of defence posture that may well be required, my first thoughts are to things like the intelligence community and cyber, which we are seen sort of as the front line, that grey war zone that we generally see. Jill, I suppose one thing, I'm happy to keep talking the strategic sort of environment at the moment, but just as we draw to close this session, just the implications on the domestic and the civil sector that they need to be considering. I mentioned that sort of foreign intelligence and the cyber is the first ones that fall out in my mind. But yeah, just your current take on from what Malcolm has said.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here. And following on from Malcolm, it is a pretty volatile environment. That's kind of a bit of an understatement, I guess. But if if I may just start with some general comments around the narrative I hear relating to national strategies and whole of nation approaches. They do require multi-sector, cross-government and wide community engagement, but there's a tendency to label what I would say are federal strategies as national, and that might be reasonable maybe when we're thinking in the context of military and defence. But even then, there are wider interests that need to be considered. And when we are being faced with such significant challenges, we need to be thinking about it domestically in terms of some of the parts. So that is across the Australian community, there are a range of interests that not only need to be considered, but also have a capability that could be leveraged. And we saw this through COVID. Individuals, communities, governments, and industry stepped up because it was important for the nation that they do so. So, you know, in terms of national approaches, we've, I think, short-circuited some of them in recent times, and the inquiries and the royal commissions have told us that we haven't engaged sufficiently and broadly enough, and we haven't taken that opportunity. And I think that's probably one of the big things domestically that we need to tap into. And to do that, we need to start a national conversation at all levels that features some plain speak. And Malcolm was, you know, brave enough to give us some of that plain speak about the multitude of challenges that are facing Australia, so that we can leverage those broader contributions and really think about this in terms of some of the parts, and rather than just expecting, for example, defence and defence industry to step in here.
Which that's definitely my thinking, is what we see at a defence level. Sort of, I consider sort of security, frontline security, as that sort of third tier down, right? After the police, law enforcement, and those agencies, you've then got frontline behind the first responders. In fact, sometimes in front of the first responders, and how are they sort of being their capability being increased? And Stephen, your experience, particularly in your role in terms of capability assessments and evaluation and uplift, I'm really interested to see what your thoughts are in terms of the national capability and uplift, particularly even with as what Jill mentioned, in post the pandemic and what we saw in the pandemic. We don't want to be seeing sort of our defence personnel at airports again, and if it is a war footing, that option is not on the table anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And you're muted, just to keep it consistent.
Thank you. If that's my cue, I'll say a few words, and thanks again for the invitation to be here this afternoon. And Malcolm obviously has painted a pretty bleak picture, and who knows what the world's going to look like in a few hours' time. But I think Jill has made some really neat points there about the consultation and the importance of that with the Australian community, because I think this is a really abundant goodwill out there, which rises above politics and the sort of issues of the day that feature prominently in our newspapers. There is a lot of goodwill, I think, to work together constructively on this question of national resilience. And I think, you know, we can throw rocks at the documents that the government puts out, but I would say, having been close around this problem now for quite a few years, in uniform and then out, and the last 6 years of my military career were spent in the capability development area, is I think we've actually come quite a long way. When you look at the strategies and the artefacts that the governments on both sides of the fence have been putting out in recent years, whether it's laws and strategies to deal with foreign interference, laws and strategies to deal with cyber. We obviously now have a coherent national defence strategy with funding. Now, we could argue priorities and quantum of funding. I get it. But I think actually things are starting to come together, but it's still missing a vital link. And I think the national defence strategy is not a national security strategy. Ahead of this session, I went back and had a quick look at the 2009 national security strategy. It's 8 pillars. Those 8 pillars that they put in that strategy, you know, with a few little word changes, they're just as relevant as today. And a strategy like that can cohere the nation. And I think the COVID pandemic did demonstrate what we can do when our interests and concerns are galvanised properly. A unified approach is key. To go to the point, I guess, to talk about resilience, perhaps from an industry's point of view, I'd simply make the point there's a lot of goodwill in industry to work with government on these big problems of the day to make Australia as resilient as it can be in the headwinds that we face now, today, tomorrow, and in the weeks and months and years ahead. And industry already invest very heavily out of their own funds to build capacity to work with government. And I think I'd simply close is that there is a mutually beneficial motive, because at the end of the day, businesses want resilience so they can continue to trade. It's as simple as that. But they also have a national interest in, you know, ensuring that Australia is a great place to live and our social, cultural fabric remains intact. So I think it's actually a really good opportunity to progress the discussion, and hopefully, you know, the dropping of these key documents is not just sort of the end of the discussion. I think actually there's quite a bit more that needs to be done.
Well, I think it's the information sharing and the consultation that's key, but the information sharing between public-private, particularly at a heightened, you know, and I term it as war footing. You know, if you think about, we are technically at war on 2 fronts at the moment, with you know, with a heightened sense on the intel. There's a high degree of trust between the public and private that's required. And again, the industry that are directly engaged with defence, they go through that sort of defence protocol, but it's the civil private security sector that often is sitting on the front line in public places and the like, but it's the last one to find out. What type of frameworks are you seeing there, and open it to you in terms of that public-private partnership? I know, say, ASIO have a business liaison unit, but again, that's more of sort of an intermittent sort of sharing of information and intelligence, but sort of public open source related content. What type of frameworks should be there, or we may already be there, but may not be sort of being front of mind?
I might say a few introductory remarks, and then I'll mute and allow my colleagues to speak. Now, you know, let me make a few comments about cyber. This is actually a very mature framework in the cyber resilience space. It has been really since 2021 with the establishment of the CTIS program, the Cyber Threat Intelligence Sharing Program between government and industry. And of course, there are other frameworks coming out of Home Affairs, which is the TISN, the Trusted Information Sharing Network, the Resilience Experts Advisory Group. There are plenty of frameworks, and ASD, ACSC have invested very heavily in establishing CTIS to be a credible platform for industry to share cyber threat intelligence insights, indicators of compromise and the like into ACSC. It's a good framework. There's a catch though. It doesn't suit the majority of players in industry. It suits the mature players, and until recently the major contributors to CTIS were members of the financial services, who you would understand and expect have very mature cyber defence resilience capabilities, and so they are able to interact with CTIS in the way in which it was designed. But they are only a very, very, very small fraction of the critical infrastructure sector, of which there are 11 sectors. So CETUS is a good program, but its reach, it doesn't go far enough. It is not tailored to particularly the smaller operators. And, you know, I'm not here to plug a CI-ISAC, but an ISAC, an information sharing and analysis centre, is a not-for-profit CTI sharing platform that works within industry, for industry, and is designed to help large, but particularly medium and small players who just don't have the bandwidth or the horsepower to interact with programs such as CETUS. And I can talk more about the ISAC model later if people would like. That's in cyber. I think in other parts of the intelligence architecture, and I'm not 100% familiar with these programs, but certainly ASIO have outreach programs in the context of the CT and foreign interference mission, and maybe Jill or Malcolm might want to comment on those. And, you know, I'm always reminded about that environment and climate that existed post 9/11 way back then, where there was actually very active information sharing into ASIO and similar law enforcement agencies. I mean, I think in this current environment, if we are in this pre-war setting, then it's really scope for innovative engagement with the public around some of these difficult questions, these areas which traditionally and typically have been recognised as government-only areas. I'd simply close by saying government can't do it all. They can do the exquisite top-end things, the things that they are absolutely designed to do, they're thoroughbreds at. But there's a whole heap of other stuff which they need to engage with industry on.
Do you think it's, yeah, thanks, Stephen. And maybe Jill, do you think it's responsive in that way, like what we did see after 9/11, what we did see in light of the pandemic? These frameworks are responsive in that way, that those gaps are filled quite quickly, identified and filled relatively quickly when they need to. Maybe the question is should we have faith in the system?
I think we should have faith in the system. I think, and as Stephen was saying, there are lots of frameworks and they're effective, they've been proven, and you know, when we do step into crisis, things click into place. I think what we're missing here is a little bit of tapping into self-interest, and you know, I guess I go back to COVID. There was a self-interest because businesses saw that they had to shut down, they had to support their employees, and so on. If we are in this pre-war footing, what's the self-interest? Because at this minute, I would suggest that a large proportion of the Australian population are, you know, going about the business and quite unaffected and not necessarily thinking about these things. And you know, we have to remember that those who are in this sector, those of us who follow actively what's happening, we get the information because we go looking for the information, I think, in large part. But if you're not aware that the information is there, if you're not triggered to go looking, it can be difficult to find for the average person in the community. And it's also quite, I think, inaccessible. And you know, recently I've heard some stories of people in the sort of national security analyst sector, research sector, talking to senior people in corporate forums. And, you know, it always surprises me that there's a whole lot of stuff you can read in the media or get through online sources that is quite accurate and quite up to date. What I'm hearing is those audiences are sometimes quite shocked about what's being said. And there isn't anything that's kind of, you know, classified that's being shared. It's all public domain, but it's about packaging it in a particular way in a pretty intense, I guess, session and discussion. And I think if those kinds of interests are surprised, we have to question, how connected the rest of Australia is. I think if the further you go north, communities are talking about these things. They're very much feeling as if they are in the firing line, as it were. But they're not getting that direct, that kind of engaged conversation with those who have deeper knowledge and deeper understanding. They're working it out for themselves.
Yeah. Malcolm, in your analysis, I suppose, are you saying, and with ASPI as well, as a team there as well, the likely immediate short-term impacts, things like the Australian sort of fuel holdings, supply chain, shipping and the like. One argument is we shouldn't be too concerned about the South China Sea access for us because our largest trading partner is China. So, that's maybe a bit of a furphy, but what we've seen even out of the Ukraine war, the immediate term impact was inflation and the like that came out of there. Are you evaluating this almost in real time in terms of the escalation out of Iran and Israel right now, the immediate impacts that we are likely to see over the sort of next 6 to 12 months?
Well, I mean, I think what we do need to start doing when we think about defence policy is think about comprehensive security in terms of not just kit, warships, fighter jets, and so forth, but in terms of the very things you're talking about in terms of supply chains, energy flows, shipping, that sort of thing, national resilience, impact of rapid global changes on global economies and how that affects trade flows and the cost of production. So, I mean, this is an area that I think we haven't really sort of had to deal with in the past, but now we're being confronted with this in a world where events can have much more rapid effect at a global level. So we're seeing, for example, right now, oil spiking through the roof as a result of these attacks in the Middle East. What's that going to do for inflation in our economy, and what does that do then on our ability to maintain defence spending? The IIP was assuming that we'd get to 2.4% GDP by the end of the decade, but how much of that is eaten up by inflation? If we have a major power war in the Indo-Pacific region, then you're quite right. All trade with China just stops. Nothing goes up, nothing comes down. So how does that affect our economy in terms of the collapse of trade with China? We're certainly not going to be trading with China if we're in a war with them. So, and even if we're not directly involved in a war with China, if they're attacking an ally such as Japan or the United States, we're not going to be trading with them. So I think that we do need to look at this more comprehensive, complex security and defense environment that goes beyond pure military aspects to the more complex, interdependent and interconnected aspects of global dynamics. And that's a more complex picture to do in terms of analyzing that on a minute by minute or day by day basis, and then trying to explain that to the broader population and how the Australian people are affected if, for example, supply chains fall apart and we can't get energy, so therefore we can't get fuel, we can't get goods from producers to market, and how does that then affect the ability to sustain spending? There's a lot there. I'm not an economist, I'm a defense analyst, but there's a lot there that defense analysts like myself have to start thinking about and factoring into our analysis beyond the sort of traditional military focus that we've always done.
And I think that's exactly where those supply chains and the way that Australia functions, we saw that during the pandemic, again, that civil security sector is immediately put into play. And, we saw sort of fights and the like, and the assaults, increase in assaults and conflict down at the local supermarkets and the like. So it has an immediate flow-on effect once that supply chain is disrupted. They're almost unknowns, the unknown unknowns in terms of what the impact is. But as I think you say, Malcolm, the time frame is shorter than it's ever been before, and those impacts are days, if not on the same day. And there will be, we've seen an increase in protests and the like, and I'm no doubt we'll see some more activity over the weekend as well. Stephen, capability uplift, discussions on national impacts, national resilience. I know the likes of Rory Metcalf from the Australian National University is about to start if he hasn't started already, a national tour to generate discussion on national security and national resilience. We've got a national cybersecurity strategy, but we don't have a national security and resilience strategy. And I've always thought that gap is crazy or not sufficient. Whose responsibility is it to be analysing these gaps and the interdependencies and the impacts? Is it purely up to government, or is it up to the private sector, someone like an ISAC, to be doing that?
Oh, I mean, okay. So I guess in terms of setting the agenda for those big issues that you've described, national resilience, national security, and getting a coherent approach to this across the various levels of government, across the various communities, across the various ethnic groups, to be frank, because they do all have different views of the problems that we look at, and then different sectors of industry. That can only come from government. I had to break the news. I mean, I did say earlier that government can't do anything, but there's one thing it can and must do is set national agendas. And plainly, and as I said earlier, the NDS and the IAP, terrific, great, tick, defence. It's great that Rory and the team from ANU are going out and attempting to make headway to set the agenda. But if we really want that national coherence that we seek, and there is an opportunity to take advantage of it now, because we are on the edge of a potential crisis, and we in Australia, like in most nations, but particularly in Australia, you actually perform pretty well under pressure. And there is an opportunity to take advantage of that, to have a serious discussion about those very issues that you speak, and to harness the goodwill in industry. And goodwill in industry, they want to support the national interest. They obviously also want to be profitable, and to look after the interests of their shareholders, and in the case of the not-for-profit sector, of their members. So government needs to set the agenda. And before I go off government, I'd simply say there are some really good artefacts now that have been dropped. National security strategy you mentioned, that's a pretty good approach to the problem. It's a little bit slow in execution, but the strategy is sound. The NDS, people will give it a pass-fail. I would give it a pass. It's probably 10 years late, but we need to get moving. Is it going to be quick enough? Will we have the money at the end of the year, as Malcolm has suggested? We'll have to wait and see. There is now an opportunity, I think, to start to knit some of these things together in a bipartisan way.
Yeah.
And, I hark back to World War II, where we actually had a unity government to deal with that particular crisis. We look at the pandemic, where there was a pretty reasonable attempt at unity across party lines to deal with difficult issues. Now, the states all went their own separate ways. That wasn't helpful. If we have a real crisis, we actually need all levels trying to pull together as best we can. Only government can do that, and there needs to be that sense of urgency and the need for unity, because one thing that will unpick the NDS and the IAP is the changing of the goalposts when governments change.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
Okay. Well, look, what we'll do is we don't want to need to go for the full hour just for the sake of it. I'm actually quite happy with that sort of introduction of where we're actually at. And I welcome you all to join us on the 30th of April as well for the next panel session, because I think as we talked about supply chains and the immediate impacts, that's where I'd like to sort of bring in the commentary of ASIAL and the like. We've got AUKUS, Curtin University quite involved with AUKUS and workforce development, because as Malcolm said, we're probably looking out over the next sort of 5 years or so by 2030. We've got a lot of workforce development, both in defence, but also within the security and national security sector. So what I'll do is I'll open it up just as closing comments. And Jill, just maybe get some takeaways when I first invited you, and sort of this is the subject matter maybe what first came to mind, or any passing message or call to action that you might have?
Yes, thanks. Look, I think for me, I've looked at this question of a national security strategy in the past, and it really depends on the scope and scale of what you're looking at, and it can get very unwieldy very quickly. So, the National Defence Strategy, I think, is a very good start. There are a couple of big powers in there about international affairs and about resilience. At the Commonwealth level, at the federal level, I think those need to be unpacked and presented to the Australian community. I think there's a lot in there that both community would be interested in, and federal departments would get value out of seeing as a framework and as kind of an integrated approach, because I think that is probably one of the things in that area that is missing. What we really are talking about, I think in my terms, is that we need to be able to tap into the social and economic infrastructure within Australia. We've talked about utilities, and we've talked about our critical infrastructure and so on. The other aspects of this are our social and economic infrastructure, and we've got a long way to go in even just reframing that. I think that's very hard to fit into a national security strategy because it soon gets very, very complex. Lots of different parties, and the sort of genuine and credible thing about this is that if you're going to ask the question, you need to listen to the answer.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've been particularly good at that for a very, very long time. So, my guidance is always, go local, think about it in a regional context, in a community context, and build it up from there. And just picking up your point, Chris, when you were saying about first responders, sometimes the first responders are not the first responders, and we do forget about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you can't wait until there's a crisis. And I think Australia is very good at running hard at a target when something goes wrong. That's not going to get us through this time round.
Thank you. And Malcolm, I'm going to keep a closing comment for you, if you can, to close it off since you opened it. But Stephen, yeah, your takeaways here, and even your initial observations since transitioning into the private sector, and then also taking on a chair of an NFP ISAC, your takeaway on this particular subject?
Look, I think overwhelmingly it's this idea that governments can't do it all. And to pick up on the listening bit, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Jill. There's got to be a good listening that governments need to give to key industry partners about what they can do to help, because there is a lot of goodwill out there. And in our own example with our ISAC, for example, we say to ASD and Home Affairs, we can extend your reach, and we can go into businesses that you're never going to get to. Yeah. Because they're too small, they're too far away from you, they're not plugged into the main narrative or the community of interest or discussion. We can help you. Let us help you. And so I think, and the final point is, there's always that challenge between the strategy and execution gap. And a lot of the execution needs to occur outside of government. It always occurs outside of government, mostly. And that also needs to be recognised, that you've got to get industry to a position where they can help execute strategies that governments are putting forward.
Wonderful, thank you. And Malcolm, your closing sort of comments, both live observations versus sort of the short-term implications that we're likely to have, and maybe things to be watching out for. As Jill said, the members of the public sometimes aren't kept fully informed, but as security and risk professionals in Australia, in the current context of conflict in multi-regions, what's your sort of advice or takeaway that we should be looking out for and be alive to?
Look, I think, from my perspective, it's the speed of events which are going to become increasingly challenging for us to manage. When we're looking at multiple events occurring in multiple domains, in multiple theatres simultaneously, it's going to be really difficult for organisations and government to just manage. It'll be a case of task saturation, particularly if crises in the Middle East and Europe and Asia escalate quickly. I think the other aspect that is worth exploring, perhaps in a future session, is how technology can assist us in this regard, but also challenge us. Artificial intelligence, we are yet to really grasp how AI can play a role in supporting decision making within government and within the private sector. But I think it will be absolutely crucial, because when you look at the military context and the future battle space, artificial intelligence is going to play a vital role in managing a very fast moving and complex battle space, and sorting disinformation and deliberate information operations by the adversary from real information. And somehow that has to be applied to a civilian national perspective, so that people understand what is fake news, what are deep fakes, what is disinformation, and can make informed decisions. So, to me, it's that speed of events that is a real challenge in front of us, both for governments and organizations, but also for the people, because we are going to be confronted with multiple threats occurring simultaneously across the globe in multiple domains, that include things like space, for example, and cyberspace. And we have to be able to grasp and manage all that information essentially simultaneously. And that's challenging for a lot of people.
Well, we will be diving into all of those. So thank you so much for that. You'll see on my shoulder there, we'll be looking at drones, robotics, autonomous systems as well. I did have sort of 3 pillars in this discussion as technology, people and process as well, that we could have guided this. But I really wanted just an initial discussion as to how the state of play as we go into this series. Last year we did 15 sessions with about 30 different speakers, and so we will deep dive into each of these aspects. But thank you very much to our opening panel, Dr. Malcolm Davis, Stephen Beaumont and Jill Savage. They're all in Canberra, as it happens. So we went straight to Canberra and got your leading thoughts. But thank you very much. Just for the audience that are with us and for the recording, I'm just going to close off. But Malcolm, you've got probably the likes of CNN knocking on your door. So welcome to finish up with us, and I'll do a closing session. But thank you very much again, and we'll speak again soon.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Malcolm. Just for the audience, next session on the 30th of April, Gary Hale, Professor Cecile Hagdal-Jaw, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Cecile. I can see you in the audience. Brian de Carey's the CEO with ASIAL, and Shannon Ford with Curtin University as well. We'll get their insights. I know Gary and can give us some sort of an update as to workforce development with AUKUS and the like. Cecile specifically looked at this in having a look at her antecedents, and they're in Perth on sabbatical with Edith Cowan. Brian will definitely bring his insights into the struggles out of the pandemic and sort of the bravery that we also saw in Sydney last week at Westfield in terms of the frontline security officers. And sadly, we've lost a security officer in that attack as well. And our condolences to everyone involved, but then also a place of worship soon after. And Shannon, I understand, is an expert in the region as well, and China relations also. So that should be a good session to follow on from that. And just for those that are with us, July 3, we're going to be up in the Sunshine Coast for Testing Tech in Paradise. We'll be covering critical infrastructure protection there. We've got some space, manufacturing and Queensland Fire and Emergency Services representation there. And that session is coming together. There's some site tours and tech tours there as well. And then the following day up in Brisbane. So if you're in Queensland, get along to these. This is with Griffith University, looking at national launch opportunities and capabilities in Australia with Equatorial Launch Australia, Southern Launch, Rocket Lab and iLaunch Trailblazer. And we'll have some more information on these events as well. So we'll see you on the 30th of April. Stephen, Jill, thank you so much for that session. This will be available on demand by Monday. And otherwise, ironically, I'm heading off to Dubai. So hopefully the water's disappeared. And I'll be definitely watching this situation. That's not encouraging, Jill, that reaction. So I'll do a risk assessment before I head off. But thank you very much. I'll end the session now. Thank you for the audience that have attended.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.